We begin. Good evening, everyone, and greetings to all. I'm proud to host you at our event about Holocaust survivors who crossed the line. Tonight's event is a lecture initiated by our first guest speaker, who I will introduce momentarily. Today is January 27th, the day that marks the liberation in 1945 of Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. In November 2005, on the 60th anniversary of this event, the United Nations declared January 27th as the International Holocaust Memorial Day. My name is Professor Ephraim Shoham Steiner of the Department of Jewish History at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba, Israel. And tonight's event is a three-way collaborative effort by our guest speaker, Yisca Harani, and two research centers at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba, the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters, and the Sidney and Esther Rabb Center for Holocaust Studies at the same university. As you may have gathered from the title of tonight's talk, it stands at the crossroads of the two topics of our two respective research centers: Holocaust studies and the study of conversion in interreligious encounters and relations. The Holocaust is thought of as a very Jewish experience, so much so that people who were rather assimilated and remote from practiced Judaism found themselves purged and persecuted during the Nazi reign of terror based on the racial laws of Nazi Germany that branded them as Jewish regardless of how they understood their own identity. The question of the Jewishness of the Holocaust experience is a tantalizing one. It touches on the very core of what the Holocaust was and of how it is remembered. To me, it was, and in many respects still is, a very personal question. As a son of a Holocaust survivor myself, who was literally, and not just figuratively, saved from the clutches of death by what we in Israel call the righteous among the nations, Chasidei Umot HaOlam, I realized the complexity of good and evil in this context. My father was persecuted and almost shot by Hungarian members of the fascist Arrow Cross Party less than 2 weeks before January 27, 1945. Most of these party members grew up in Catholic circles in interwar Hungary. These were also the exact same circles in which the people who saved my father at the behest of Raoul Wallenberg grew up in. Wallenberg was a Swedish Lutheran, but working with him and aiding him in saving Jews like my father were people like Karo Sabo and Pal Salai, whose pictures are in my background, two young Catholic men, Hungarian nationalists, who were drawn to the nationalistic rhetoric of the Hungarian right, but at the same time could not turn away from what they were taught on Sunday schools, in church, and in the Catholic Boy Scout movement about humanistic Christian values. The teachings of Christ about compassion to fellow men, any man, resonated with them to the point that they had abandoned the Arrow Cross Party and joined Raoul Wallenberg in saving Jews in Budapest in late 1944 and early 1945. They, of course, were not alone. The Yad Vashem Memorial and Museum in Jerusalem highlights and commemorates those non-Jews who risked their lives and saved Jews during the dark days of the Holocaust. The lesson my father took from these dreadful times was how man can fall, but also how man can be elevated. My father himself rose from the ashes, immigrated to Israel, and lived his life as a proud Jew in the ancient Jewish homeland here in Israel. However, as we will be hearing today, other survivors made other choices and chose different paths. The lecture we will be hearing today will discuss the stories of some of those survivors who chose to cross the line and convert to Christianity. Tonight's guest speaker is my personal friend, Mrs. Yisca Harani. Yisca graduated from Tel Aviv University's History Department and the Program for Religious Studies. Her field of expertise is Christianity in the Holy Land, with a specific interest in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Yisca serves as an ad hoc consultant for government ministries, among them the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of Religions, the Ministry of Tourism, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Prime Minister's Office. She is also a consultant for private and public companies and is frequently interviewed in public broadcasting channels. Yisca Harani guides and instructs study tours for experts and students seeking to specialize in Christianity and how to properly address Christian audiences, as well as guiding participants in academic conferences on religions and religious studies. For many years, Yisca Harani has been an active member in the interreligious dialogue in Israel, and for which she was presented with the Mount Zion Foundation Award for Reconciliation in 2013. Responding to Yisca's lecture is my colleague, Dr. Becky Cook. Dr. Cook is a senior lecturer at the Department of Politics and Government at Ben-Gurion University. She teaches and researches issues generally related to Israeli society and Israeli identity, and more specifically to the Israel collective memory of the Holocaust. Recently, Dr. Cook received, along with Fanny Yuval, a grant from the Israeli Ministry of Science, to investigate the contemporary grassroots Israeli commemorative project known as Zikaron Basalon, Living Room Memorial. I guess that's the best translation I could come up with. Which has been gaining traction in Israeli society alongside the institutionalized memory of the Holocaust. Due to the number of participants, we are already standing at almost 146 people in the Zoom and probably way more in the Facebook Live. We will not hold a regular Q&A session at the end of this talk, but rather, if you have a question, please write it into the chat about 20 minutes before the end of Yisca's talk. We will announce that the chat is open for questions. Please put your questions and remarks in the chat, and I will try, and time permitting, to address them to our speakers when they conclude their respective lectures. The chat, as I said, will be open about 20 minutes before the conclusion of Yisca's lecture. So at this, I turn you to Mrs. Yisca Harani, who will talk about Holocaust survivors who crossed over the line. Yisca, please.
Thank you, Professor Ephraim, Effie, my friend. So my lecture is titled Holocaust Survivors Who Crossed Over the Line. And I'm really full of gratitude to the two centers in the Ben-Gurion University who host this evening. Nevertheless, I want to make clear that I'm not going to give here an academic hypothesis or an academic analysis. I'm going to share with you stories of survivors while pondering about their identity and how and who defines identities. So I've chosen three personalities, those that you see now. They had the chance to meet each other. Two of them had very, very close relationship. They all share things, and they also diverge in others. They all are from Polish background. Their loved ones went to Auschwitz and died in Auschwitz. I will begin with a personality very well known in France. I assume that for some of you, some of our listeners here, know much better than I do about the lives of at least the first two personalities. People from France and relatives of the Lustiger family may know much more. But I will begin with a paper clipping that you see on the right side of your slide in Hebrew. I will later tell you where that paper clipping comes from, but it was in the year 2007 when the cardinal died. That cardinal that was also named the Jewish cardinal. Now that is not a joke, and that is not just a film. It's a film based on reality. So what the paperclip says is that saying Kaddish at the funeral of the Catholic cardinal, Jean-Marie Lustiger was one of the most important ecclesiastical leaders of the Christian world. Lustiger was the cardinal of the Catholic Church in Paris and was candidate to the position of the Pope. Lustiger never hid the fact that he was born a Jew, that his original name was Aharon Lustiger. During the Holocaust, after his mother was killed in an extermination camp, Lustiger converted before his death. Lustiger converted. Before his death, Lustiger requested mourner's Kaddish prayer to be chanted during his funeral and that his birth name, Aharon, be written on his gravestone. So I want to make sure that we see the verb converted, conversion. Well, the Hebrew in that paper clipping says the Hebrew verb hemir. And as you see, this is not a regular newspaper. It's a newspaper for new immigrants. That's why it has the vowel system. But then it says in parenthesis, hechlif, changed. Why is that? Why did they need in the Hebrew paper to add the word hechelif? Because this is a common word. This is a common verb. Hemir, hamara, conversion, that is a very negative term for Hebrew speakers. We will get to that later. I would like to show you these pictures of the Lustiger family. On the left-hand side, you see Charles and Giselle, whose Hebrew name was Leah. They were both from Polish origin. They lived in Paris. They ran a store in Paris. When their children were born, here you see Aharon. They also had a daughter. When they were young, they got quite an austere education. They had to play the piano for many hours. The family, one would say, was a secular family. Aharon Lustiger reports that there was God, but there was no much discussion about God. Well, it is in 1940, as you know, that Nazi Germany occupies France. And the family needs to move to Orléans. Why? In order to safeguard the children. In 1943, the parents are sent to Auschwitz. The kids are safe in Orléans. The father survived. The mother was murdered in Auschwitz. But there's a turning point in the story. It was in 1940, before the mother died, unlike the newspaper information. It was before the mother passed away in Auschwitz and before she was deported to Auschwitz that young Lustiger, 14 years of age, decided to be baptized. And he was baptized no less than by the Bishop of Orléans, given the name Jean-Marie. In the book, a heavy book that he published called Choosing God and Chosen by God, he wrote the following. I explained that baptism would not make me abandon my Jewish condition. Quite the contrary, it would lead me to find it, to receive the plenitude of its meaning. I did not have the feeling that I was betraying any heritage or camouflaging myself or abandoning anything whatsoever. Just the opposite. I felt I was going to find the meaning of what I had received at birth. The young Aharon, while being in Orléans, was greatly influenced by one of his school teachers. Apparently, that school teacher was very much inclined to science. He taught them science, and at the very same time was a devout Catholic. Well, he then informed his parents. His mother went back to Paris to make sure the store is still operating. She would come on a weekly basis to visit her children. In one of those occasions, he told her and the father about his desire to be baptized. He writes in the book, the day that I informed my parents, it was an extremely painful scene, completely unbearable. For my parents, this reasoning was thoroughly incomprehensible, insane, and insufferable, the worst misfortunes that could befall them. I was acutely aware that I was causing them an unendurable pain. I was torn apart by their suffering, and I truly took the step only because of an interior necessity. Well, after becoming Christian, he quickly climbs up into the world of great achievements. He was an intellectual. He graduated the Sorbonne in the field of literature. In 1954, he decides to become a priest and is ordained as a priest. He's in 1979 ordained as the Bishop of Orléans, the same place, the same cathedral where he was baptized. But this time he's ordained by John Paul II. In 1981, he's ordained Archbishop of Paris, which is the highest ranking title for hierarchy in the Catholic Church in France. And in 1983, he's ordained a cardinal, which means that in 12 years, he was climbing up that hierarchy ladder. In 1951, he first visits Israel, or visits it for the first time. He will come many times later. He will come in the 70s with his students, and he will come again, as we will hear later, in 1995. Now, as the Archbishop of Paris, he visits Auschwitz. The first visit was in 1983. It was around an issue, a thorny issue, of a Carmelite monastery that was positioned near Auschwitz. It is therefore that on this occasion, also the chief rabbi of France was there, Rabbi Sirat. He told that he saw the Archbishop moving to the side at some point and crying. Of course he was crying. His mother was murdered there. In 2005, he comes again to Auschwitz, but as he explicitly wrote, I don't want to return because it is a place of death and destruction. If I'm going, it is because the Pope asked me. Times and again, when he was asked and he had the need to explain the relationship between himself being born a Jew and now a baptized Christian, he said the following: I was born Jewish and so I remain, even if that's unacceptable to many. For me, the vocation of Israel is bringing light to the Goyim, the nations. That's my hope, and I believe that Christianity is the means for achieving it. And in other words, he says, I'm not leaving you. I'm not passing into the enemy camp. I'm becoming what I am. I'm not stopping being a Jew, just the opposite. I'm discovering a way of living it. This is very dramatic to read these words when you look at this photograph on the right and you see him carrying the cross up Montparnasse, the very same neighborhood where he grew up, but returning this time as a Christian and as an archbishop. Among his many publications and many books, he wrote a book called The Promise. All his books, of course, were written in French and only later translated to many languages. Well, in this book called The Promise, he goes into a very deep and interesting reading of the Gospel of Matthew, and he claims that there's actually a double promise. The statement of the book is the statement of two promises. The promise of Israel as the elect people of God, something that many Jews would agree, but then also the promise that Jesus is fundamentally their Redeemer and Savior. And that's where the roads diverge, because many people of Jewish people would, of course, not agree to that. And indeed, with the fact that there was great friendship between the cardinal or the archbishop and Jewish intellectuals and Jewish rabbis, there were also clear understandings that there is some misunderstanding. Well, in 1981, Rabbi Sirat was chosen to be the chief rabbi of France. A few months later, it was Jean-Marie Lustiger who was appointed, ordained to be the Archbishop of Paris. They did have a warm relationship, and they had meetings at numerous occasions. Rabbi Sirat himself gave evidence to the fact that the cardinal used to enter the great synagogue of Paris to say Kaddish for his mother, I guess apparently also for his father. And for that purpose, he would take off the habit and enter as any other person. So if we return again to the understanding, self-understanding of the cardinal, here is something interesting. On the day of his ordination, Lustiger said that he saw himself both as a Jew and as a Christian, and that he is manifesting his Jewishness by being a faithful Christian. We will see that that claim is being repeated by Jewish people who converted to Christianity. But the response of Rabbi Sirat was the following. Together with the rabbis in France, I have outspokenly criticized this unison that he has proposed. Another rabbi commented, when one could prove that a circle is in fact a square, then will he agree to accepting that a Jew is also a Christian? But there were much harsher words than that. Elie Wiesel, and please note that most of his friends were survivors of the Holocaust. So Elie Wiesel, following that book that we just saw before, wrote an article in Le Monde. And what he writes is that Lustiger's writing is admirable in sincerity. It's provocative, it's fascinating. Yet, Wiesel continued, how can we not remind him that these are two religions linked to each other and even close to each other, but not identical? Countless Jews have proven this through centuries of persecution and oppression, opting for death by sword rather than kissing the cross. And he insisted, Elie Wiesel, I still believe that for a Jew, salvation is only possible within his Jewishness. Well, there were even harsher words, and the harsher words came in 1995. This time, it was Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, one who had close relationship also with the cardinal. But it was 1995 that Lustiger was invited to come to the Memorial Day, the Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel, both to Yad Vashem and to Tel Aviv University, where there was a conference. The conference was titled, Where is God during the Holocaust? He was objecting the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Lau, being a Holocaust survivor and being a devout Jew. He was objecting to the invitation of Lustiger, and he wrote these harsh words. The spiritual destruction which Lustiger represents, just like the physical destruction, is a step towards the final elimination of the problem of the Jews. Also in Yad Vashem, there was a controversy. The president of the National Committee of Yad Vashem, Yosef Burg, who objected, and indeed Lustiger did not end up in this ceremony. Whoever converted to Christianity crossed the line and does not belong to the Jewish people. It was the decision, finally, of the Minister of Education at the time that he will not join the Yad Vashem ceremony. He did join the conference in Tel Aviv University. Lustiger kept saying, I know I'm a Jew, but in a different religion. Well, the funeral of Lustiger in 2007 took place in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which is a huge honor to be buried there, but every Archbishop of Paris has the right to be buried there. But in the Cardinal's will, there was this request, that Psalm 113 will be recited in Hebrew and French by his nephew, Jonas Moses Lustiger, and that soil from Mount of Olives will be put in his grave or on his grave. Well, I will tell you that that soil was taken from the monastery's soil, the monastery on Mount of Olives where Sister Paula lived, the one from whose drawer this paper clipping was taken. So he is buried in this sort of Jewish gestures, Jewish customs, but more than that. His cousin, Arno Lustiger, said the Kaddish. It was said outside the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And then the funeral, the coffin was led into the cathedral itself. Just look at this cathedral. Can you imagine that a Jew was buried there? But what is more striking is the fact that on his tombstone, the following is written. These are the words that he specifically asked to be inscribed on his tombstone. I was born Jewish. I received the name of my paternal grandfather, Aharon. Having become Christian by faith and by baptism, I have remained Jewish, as did the apostles. I have as my patron saints, Aharon the high priest, Saint John the apostle, Holy Mary full of grace. And then it continues to say that he's number so-and-so of the archbishops of Paris, etc. Well, in Israel, there's a place where Lustiger felt very much at home. It is outside Jerusalem, Abu Ghosh, where there's a Benedictine monastery. In the 70s, the Benedictines, for the first time, entered to inhabit the place. Lustiger was very much interested in the place. He came to the place. The first prior of that abbey was a converted Jew, Jean-Baptiste Gourion. So there was a lot about Jewish-Christian relations that took place in this monastery. In 2013, a beautiful garden was inaugurated, naming Cardinal Lustiger. What you see here, these places where groups can sit, meditate, speak about Jewish-Christian relations, the water, the vegetation, and these two plaques remind everybody the words of Jean-Marie Lustiger. Very similar to what was written on his tomb in Notre Dame. I was born Jewish and I have remained Jewish. But there's another plaque, very interesting, put in the garden. And it says his words also. The joint future for Jews and Christians does not come down to minimizing possible conflicts. This future requires addressing what is shared just as much as what divides us. Work that is now possible based on the assurance that is a friendship which God wills. So this is the message of Cardinal Lustiger, which was the message of we are here to talk. We are here to share. We can share also the differences, but we're not giving up on the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. He was considered a very important promoter of Jewish-Christian relations. It's a big question whether a convert should be in that discussion, in that dialogue. But anyway, he did what he could. And here you see a memorial day for Lustiger in that very garden. You see Jewish people, you see Christian people. What is very interesting is that on that specific day when there was a memorial, very special memorial with the attendance of a cardinal, Rabbi Sirat could not attend. He wanted to, but he could not come from France. He came a few weeks later. And in that garden, as I was told by the monks and by the community of Abu Ghosh, he was facing Jerusalem and he recited Shirei HaMa'alot, the Psalms, the songs of ascent. So the friendship remained. I would like to move now to the second personality. If Lustiger was famous in France, I guess the story of brother Daniel, Shmuel Oswald Rufhausen, is rather known here in Israel. Actually, his case is being taught in many schools as part of civic studies. Shmuel was born Jewish to a Jewish family. His brother Aryeh, both grew up in a village, in a town. His other name was Oswald. Later, he'll be known as Brother Daniel because he himself chose that name when he was baptized, because he felt he was in the lion's den. Nechama Tek wrote a beautiful book. I highly recommend to you to get that book either in English or in its Hebrew translation, Begov Ha'arayot. I guess it is the most intensive book giving all the details of the history of Brother Daniel. So in 1922, he was born, as I said before, in Poland. But maybe he's more famous linked with the town of Mir. But I will come to Mir in a minute. So he was born in this Jewish place and attended Akiva Zionist movement. Actually, they spent 2 years in Vilna preparing for Aliyah, immigration to Israel. But in 1941, he was captured and jailed by the Gestapo. Luckily, he escaped and acquired a certificate of being a German Polish Christian. His ability to master languages, something that he was famous about, but especially the German language because he studied it in school. So his ability to master the German led to the fact that he was asked to become the assistant of the chief of police of the German police in the city of Mir. This is Daniel, and that's him with his brother. Mir was a famous Jewish place. It was famous and is still famous. The name is linked with the yeshiva, with the Jewish study house, the Harvard of the yeshivot. Well, it moved before the catastrophe. Outside Poland, it moved to Shanghai, today a famous place in Bnei Brak. But it was not only famous for its religious community that you see here on the left. It was famous also for the Zionist activity that was there, for people that were more liberal in their perception. Well, the third president of the State of Israel, Zalman Shazar, was coming from Mir. But the catastrophe of Mir was, as you see here. In 1941, a section of the town of Mir was made into a ghetto. 2,400 Jews were pushed into it. The first massacre was in November 1941 with 1,400 Jews killed. The second was with hundreds of people killed in August 1942. Here you see the monument in the cemetery Nachalat Yitzchak in Tel Aviv, where yearly there's the gathering of the survivors to come and identify with the horrible history of Mir. Well, here you see that there are survivors from Mir. How is it possible that there are survivors? Well, on the night of the 9th of August, 3 days before the last massacre and the liquidation of the ghetto, it says here 200, I'm sorry for that, it's a mistake. 316 Jews fled the ghetto through the forest, mostly underground fighters of the ghetto. How did that come about? How would they know that 4 days before the horrible massacre that they should run away? Well, it was Oswald Rufhausen who leaked the news to the underground of Mir Ghetto, telling them that this is going to take place. 316 people ran in the darkness of the night. Others, children, elderly people, and people who just did not believe that information, missed the opportunity. In this gathering, you see Daniel Rufhausen in the center of those at least 200 that came to live in Israel. The story of how this collaboration between the ghetto fighters and Oswald Rufhausen, who pretended to be a German Christian, well, it started like this. The testimony is in Yad Vashem. The commander of Mir was walking in our direction, report two people, one of them Bercheke, a Jewish man from the ghetto who was an electrician and was asked to come and fix something in the office of the police. I recognized the officer as Rufhausen, says Berchke. He recognized me as well. How did the two recognize each other? They were in Vilna together. They were this Zionist group of young people who were ready to make the immigration to Israel. After the commander continued walking, he told me, Shlomo, today I will come to see you. And indeed, that's what he did. Oswald, in the book of Mir, where a lot of that is being reported, writes how Meister Heinz's office there was a locked cabinet filled with weapons, guns, pistols, and grenades. Every time I would take one of them and place it in the bushes in the garden and give it to Israel Resnick through the ghetto's gate in the evening. Through this method, I have given him 12 guns. Sometimes I would place a rifle in the stable's dumpster and in the evening would bring it to the ghetto. Well, Oswald, through this very meeting, where he was next to the commander, to the chief officer of the German police, he was not betrayed by Berchke, and he made the next move and actually risked his life by bringing ammunition to the ghetto fighters. But then it was clear that when the last massacre is going to take place, they will not be able to fight. And he warned the people in the ghetto, and he told the underground fighters, you have to run for your life. The story is recorded again by the mere survivors. The destruction of the Jews in our ghetto was no different from the fate of all other Jewish communities, great and small, across Nazified Europe. We, the sons and daughters of the town of Mir, remember the man and the phenomenon named Oswald, thanks to whom we fled. That is, those of us who fled by the skin of our teeth. I will tell you how it happened. Well, Oswald was in the office when the decision was taken that the ghetto will be liquidated. It was then, at that very night, that he put misinformation into the police station, saying that partisans are going in the forests, in the very other side of Mir. On that night, when the forces, all the police forces, were going to the forests, at that very night, the 316 people fled to the other side. In the morning, when that was realized, it was clear that treason is the name of the game. And Oswald was brought before the chief commander, and he was accused of treason. He was put in a locked room and escaped a second time. In this writing here of the mere survivors, the person here that you see here is saying, you, Shmuel, belong to us alone, to the survivors and to those who died from the Mir ghetto. You belong to the Jews, and above all, to the Jews of Mir. Dearest Shmuel, and forgive me that I find it hard to call you Brother Daniel. Why is it difficult to call him Brother Daniel? Because nobody knew what happened with Shmuel Oswald Rufhausen when the survivors eventually made it and came to Israel, to the young state. Later they heard that he was baptized. What happened with Brother Daniel, or Shmuel Oswald at the time, was that once he escaped the locked room from the police station, he had to run for his life and to quickly find a place where he could hide. The closest door to the police station was the monastery of the Carmelite sisters. Actually, the police station itself was part of that monastery, a building that was confiscated from the sisters. The sisters knew Oswald very well. He knocked on the door. The shocked sister let him in, called quickly the Mother Superior, and the Mother Superior, Eusebia Bartkowiak, let him in. He explained to her very quickly that he is a Jew, that he betrayed the German police. And she, without hesitation, let him into the monastery, despite the fact that some of the sisters rejected that decision, and she hid him there. Oswald Rufhausen was hiding in the monastery for 4 months. Actually, his hiding room was the same wall, had the same wall as the police station. He could hear what was happening in the police station. Of course, the monastery was searched, but his hiding place was not found. 4 months later, there was a rumor that all houses are going to be thoroughly searched for petrol, for goods, whatever the Germans needed. It was then that he realized that the sisters are in grave danger. Eusebia, the Mother Superior, was shattered when she understood that he's running out and endangering himself. But he said, I have to go. And indeed, he went into the forests. He joined the partisans. He was known for his incredible courage, but also for the fact that the third time he escaped his death, and that was when partisans were about to execute him because they were afraid that he is a German spy within them. Well, the next amazing story is that in 1957, November 1957, Katriel Katz, who is the ambassador in Warsaw, is in his evidence saying, "My secretary had informed me that a Christian priest is waiting outside my office and that he is requesting that I see him privately. What is your name?" "Brother Daniel." I told him to come in. A short statue man came in, covered in the monk's brown cape, wearing his sandals, a necklace and a cross. In his hand, he held a thick book, the book of the ghetto fighters. "I'm Brother Daniel, a monk from the Carmelite monastery." The monk thus presents himself in perfect Hebrew. "I'm Shmuel Oswald Rufhausen. I'm a Jew. I'm a Zionist. I came to request that you help me receive an Israeli citizenship. I'm Oswald Rufhausen, who is mentioned in the book of the ghetto fighters." Katriel Katz goes on to explain that there were many Polish Jews who pretended to be Christians and later came in a very shy way to his embassy to request to gain citizenship in order to come to Israel. Well, Brother Daniel did come to Israel. And when he came to Israel, he met with his brother, Aryeh, and with the family who lived in Bustan HaGalil. This is Brother Daniel. This is Aryeh's brother. He met with the survivors, for example, the people who collaborated with him with the smuggling of ammunition. Here you see him in that cemetery, Nachalat Yitzchak. You see him with the kippah because it is a memorial day for the Mir community. Here you see him in a Hanukkah event in his brother's family's house. I would like for a minute to share with you this video when Brother Daniel has a celebration arranged by the survivors of Mir, putting this party on because they feel a lot of gratitude to him. Let us hear a few of the words that are said to him and then some of his own words.
רק מי שהיה יכול להעריך את כל צד שלו. אני לא רוצה להיכנס, נגעו פה בנקודה שאוסטרד התגלגל לנצרות וכך הלאה. הנכון הוא שכל אלה שאם זה ניצולי גטומיר ואם זה יהודים אחרים, בגלל הסטיגמה שיש לנו לנוצרות, ואנחנו סבלנו מהנוצרים, ולא סבלנו, יכולים לסבול גם המוסלמים. אבל במקרה שלנו הספציפי נתנו נצרות. בגלל זה שבתור ילדים הרגשנו את האנטישמיות. אז החיבור הזה לא התקבל אצלנו כמובן מאליו. אנחנו מקבלים את זה בגלל האישיות של אוסטרד, ולא בגלל החיבור הזה, ולא יודע להגיד. בזה אני רוצה רק להגיד שאנחנו נשתדל, עוד נעשה החלום שלי, או התפילה שלי, לעשות איזה מפגש עם דור השני ושלישי עם אוסטרד. כי רק בזכותו יש דור הזה, ישנם ילדים, ישנם נכדים, ישנם נינים כבר כנראה, במפגשים מהסוג השמח והטוב.
הייתה גם התקופה הזאת של מיר, שהיא בעיניי הילה, בעיניי, לא אני, כן, אלא התקופה היא בעיניי איכשהו עטופה בהילה. תקופה בשבילי, זה לא רק עניין של הצלה, זאת הייתה בעצם מלחמה. עד שאני הגעתי למיר הייתי חיה נרדפת, שניסתה להציל את עצמה. צורה כזאת, אחרת אנחנו כולנו מכירים את זה. כשהגעתי שם פתאום הרגשתי שוב טעם בחיים. טעם בחיים באופן מיוחד אחרי שנפגשתי עם ברצ'קה. עם ברצ'קה. כי אז פתאום נוצר קשר. ואז ידעתי שיש לי תפקיד. יש לי תפקיד בחיים וניסיתי, אני יודע אם עשיתי את הכל בוודאי לא עשיתי, אבל מה שיכולתי עשיתי, ואני נורא שמח. אני נורא שמח כשהנכד של, זאת אומרת הבן של ברצ'קי, שהיה פה לפני רגע, לפני שעתיים עוד היה פה, כן, הוא בא אליי במיוחד ואומר, אוסוולד, אתה מוכרח לבוא לבר מצווה של הבן שלי.
So that's it. He was very much in relationship with the Jewish community of the mere survivors, with the family, and with other Jewish people that he met. He was also very much surrounded by the very unique community that he created, which was the Hebrew-speaking Catholic community in Haifa, the place where he resided. Being a Carmelite father, he joined the Stella Maris Carmelite community. But then comes the crux of the story, and that is the story of whether or not Brother Daniel, being born Jewish, being a savior of Jews during the war, was he entitled to get the citizenship just because he was born Jewish? Well, there is this law of return, famously written and signed by David Ben-Gurion from 1950, which claims that every Jew has the right to come to this country as an ole, as an immigrant. As you see here, there is a photograph of a typical identity card where it says here that this person has come as an immigrant according to the law of return, unlike what is crossed below, which is somebody that comes and gets permanent residency. Well, according to the Israeli citizenship, then every Jewish immigrant is immediately receiving upon his arrival Israeli citizenship. Here are the words translated because he wrote them in Hebrew. I, the below signatory, the priest Oswald Rufhausen, and at the monastery, Father Daniel, kindly request that I be given permission to stay permanently in Israel and that I be given a passport. I base my request on my Jewish national affiliation, which I maintained, despite receiving the Catholic religion in 1942 and entering the monastery in 1945. Well, the response of the state was indeed dramatic. Two opposing views. The rabbinate's perception was he should be given citizenship as a Jew. Why? Because he's born Jew. He was born Jewish. His fate was with his people. Regardless of any faith decision he had made along the way, he is Jewish. Whereas the Supreme Court, representing a non-religious state, a non-religious judicial system, one cannot be a Catholic and a Jew. A Jew may be an apikoris, as we say, a skeptic or a non-believer, but not one who is a believer in another faith. Well, Brother Daniel, surprisingly, who came in the 50s, in 1962, filed to the High Court of Justice a demand that he will be recognized as a citizen. That is why this is being taught until today in the high schools and in the universities, as the case of Brother Daniel. There was an amendment made specifically because of his case. And the amendment says that the rights of the Jew under this law and the rights of an immigrant under that nationality law is that, you know, everyone who was born a Jew can be a citizen, except for a person who has been a Jew and has voluntarily converted his religion. Which led into a very big question, and that is, what does it mean to convert to a different religion? If we will hear the words of Brother Daniel, what he had to say in his own will is this: I experienced everything in my lifetime, and I no longer fear death. I'm afraid of memory. I don't know if I am to be doomed or spared, but from all things you may know about me, I would like you to remember that I was born a Jew and died a Jew. This is his tombstone. It is in the cemetery, indeed, Christian cemetery, but it is the public's cemetery in Haifa. You see the stone placed on his tomb, where in the Stella Maris church, there is a plaque commemorating him in the same crypt where the other brothers are laid to rest. So what does it mean to move to a different religion, to change a religion? Well, an expert's opinion was submitted to the Ministry of Interior time and time again in 1987 when another case of that sort was brought to the court. And this is the interesting way it is articulated by that expert's opinion. The expression, a different religion, should not be examined vis-a-vis any religious canon or law, yet against the Jewish historical sentiment. Conversion includes a public disengagement from the historical image of the people of Israel. What is considered as disengagement? The answer lies in the historical reality. And the answer is that history has played its part for 2,000 years. And the name Jesus Christ has become a symbol of the antithesis of Judaism and severance from its history. Whether this is correct or not in the eyes of the historical Jesus of Nazareth is completely irrelevant. It is interesting that both the judicial system and the expert's perception is not the religious question, whether an incarnated God is the stone of obstacle between the religions, but rather the 2,000 years of history. The 2,000 years have become the barrier, a barrier that cannot be crossed. And with this, allow me to come to the third personality in my lecture. And the third personality was also born in Poland, also chose the Catholic faith, and like Brother Daniel, died in the country of Israel, buried in Jerusalem. This is Sister Paula, who was born in 1929 and passed away 2 years ago, January 2 years ago. This is the monastery where she lived for 45 years. On the roof of that monastery, one can have a beautiful panorama of Jerusalem. One can look at the old city, at the modern city. This is Sister Paula on the roof. And this is her Polish passport. The story of Sister Paula begins as a child called Rachel or Rochale, born not far away from Lomja. Her parents moved to Lomja because they had some business there. Her biological mother died when she was very young, and the stepmother took care of her. Well, the story of Lomja is the story of so many other places. The community was pushed into the ghetto, was liquidated, and as in other places, those that managed to run away ran either to their death or to life. These are the parents. The father, Simcha, as is recorded here in the identity card given by the State of Israel to Paula, an identity card that says that she's a permanent resident. So it says Simcha and Tzipora, Feigl. These are the biological parents. Here, the father with the stepmother and Sister Paula. Later, a brother will be born. His name is Yitzchak. How did Sister Paula, Rochale, ended up in this monastery on Mount of Olives, where this community took this picture on that roof that we saw before, and here you see Sister Paula sitting on the left side. She had become the person in charge of guests coming. Here she's preparing the table for me when I was supposed to come to the place, and here is my niece. I knew her some 27 years ago, when the Mother Superior of the place at the time, Mère Christine, invited me to the monastery and introduced me to Sister Paula. I was very privileged to be a sort of a friend to her in those last 25 years that we knew each other. It is in this paper that she's recording the history of how she became from Rochale to becoming a Christian Paula. Well, it was the request of the Mother Superior, and to her she addresses the letter where she says, Those were the circumstances under which I met Jesus. It was on the 6th of January, 1943, at high noon. I was wandering around fields and country roads together with my friend that I escaped the ghetto with, to find some shelter from the Polish winter and the freezing temperatures that come with it. Suddenly, a gang of young boys came out of the village. Our refuge turned out to be a cross, standing at the crossroad of Polish countryside. We both knelt before it, calling Jesus, Jesus, in order to mislead our oppressors. And like that, this man, hanging on the cross, suffering, ailing, oppressed just like myself, and the Jew too, became close to me, so close to me that I couldn't forget about him. Then the involuntary 3-month spiritual retreat, and here I'll say that she had her own humor, because the potato cellar was not really a place for spiritual retreat, but she was in a potato cellar for 3 months. That did the rest. I started believing that this God of Christians, of Poles, is a son of God, the God of myself and of my fathers. And it was there at the entrance to the cellar where I swore to him, if I make it through the war, I will become a Christian, will be completely devoted to you and join a monastery. I was 13 at the time, and I was perfectly aware how much suffering I would bring upon my family if they found out I converted to Christianity. When they escaped the ghetto, her father was already murdered by the Nazis. She escaped with her mother and the brother, and at some point they split. Until her last day, Paula, Sister Paula, carried deep pain for splitting from her mother and her brother. She kept saying, maybe he's alive. Who knows? Maybe he survived. Anyway, on that very day, when she was already parting from her mother, she was going with a friend, Sarah. Sarah survived also in the cellars, in the forests. Sarah lived in Australia, and you can see them when they met each other, when they found each other quite a few years later. Well, she continues, Paula, with her story. The war was coming to an end. The time had come to fulfill the promise I gave to my Lord. I asked to be baptized, which came to pass on the 27th of March, 1945. I wished to join the strictest type of monastery, the toughest kind, so that I could burn down fast in there, surrender myself whole and all my love to God. And, listen to this, to obtain mercy for my poor, suffering nation. In the end, I chose the monastery of the Benedictine sisters in Lomja. Well, this is not exactly the monastery in Lomja, this is the monastery on Mount of Olives, but the monasteries of the Benedictines at that time used to have very strict life. Perhaps another paradox is the fact that she returns to Lomja, to the place of the ghetto, to the place where her father was murdered, from where her mother and brother were taken to their death, and yet she becomes a sister in Lomja, in a monastery which is within a walking distance from her home. On that day of my eternal vows, I renewed my sacrifice for Israel. This is a picture of the monastery. Here, Paula is reclining. This is the Mother Superior of the time. I have to cut my story short because we are in lack of time, but you can believe me. Her diaries, her letters indicate a very dramatic period. She was not accepted to the monastery, as you may think, so quickly. She was rejected. She had to wait quite a long time until there was much confidence in her to let her in to become what she wanted. She writes, I didn't even know that my nation had already won a little motherland for themselves, and I had dreamt about while still in the ghetto. Every day in her life, she was thinking about her people, and she was also thinking about the pain that it created to the survivors of the family and to her family that ran away before the war to Argentina, Australia, and America. They searched for her. When they found her, they wanted her back. She denied that. She wanted to stay in the monastery. And that caused great pain to both sides. My family, annoyed and angered with my stubbornness, went silent. All the contact was painfully cut. They have come to see her in the monastery. She was, of course, excited to see them, but she wouldn't go back with them. This is what she writes in her diary, and this is the exact Polish page where she writes this. One has to be converted from Judaism to understand the tragedy of the heart. Your own people reject you, and the strangers don't accept you. A converted Jew has no place in this world. For him exists only heaven. I've understood it quite early, and because of this, there is this big and constant desire of the death. Today, after these years, I don't pray for the conversion of the individuals. This is too big a torture. There is no more a complete person with own identity. Huge suffering will overwhelm his soul. In 1959, somebody brings to the monastery a journal where there's an article about a certain Father Daniel. And the article title is, I'm a Jew. Sister Paula requests the Mother Superior to write a letter. 12 years after she wrote a letter to her family members, she's now writing a letter to Brother Daniel. She gets a response. They start to correspond. Together with another previously Jewish Catholic sister who moved to Israel, she's building up to her decision, the decision to move to Israel. By then, it is already 1975. She's been in a monastery for 30 years. But now, my family, who cut correspondence with me, couldn't give up on her. And like that, after 11 years of silence, I suddenly got a letter from them. My family wished to see me and asked me in their letters if I couldn't possibly visit them. The impossible became possible. She was given the permission to travel with a sister from the Benedictine monastery to visit their relatives in America. These are very moving pictures of Sister Paula, Rochale, as she is called by her family. Here is the sister that accompanied her, this time in Brooklyn, with a family where a rabbi was still holding so much to his Orthodox faith. Another branch of the family in Argentina. They all welcomed her. They loved her. They were also sure that after that visit, she will decide to stay. For her, one of the most powerful experiences was participation in the Sabbath feast. That supper left me very impressed. It felt to me like that was exact way Jesus once sat with his disciples. So she felt how Jewish she was. This is what she writes. Converting to Catholicism didn't mean I was no longer Jewish. My attachment to my nation wasn't broken. In fact, it was stronger than before. It was the monastery where I realized who I am. And it was the monastery who allowed her. And it was, again, a very long road, and I'm cutting it short, that she arrived to Israel on October 1975. She will live here for the next 45 years. When she comes here, of course, she's eager to meet Father Daniel and to meet that sister that was once a Carmelite sister from a Jewish background. She finds people that are dressed, I'll say, normally. That sister is no longer in a monastery. What happened around Brother Daniel was a community of people who wanted to live normal Israeli life, defining themselves as Zionist, caring much for their Jewish fellow men. For Sister Paula, that was a shock. Brother Daniel was very much urging her to do the same. It was too difficult for her. Surrendering the habit was impossible. She was driven by Father Daniel in December 1975 to Jerusalem. And there she found herself finally. For 45 years, she was now in the place that was really hers. Why was it so dear to her? There was blissful peace in my soul. I felt that this was my place. I was freezing in that cold, but it was nothing compared to the happiness I had inside. The same soil he walked on, the same sky, the same stars his eyes gazed upon. He spent his days there, prayed, suffered. He was so close around here. And then came the case of applying for citizenship. She filed whatever was needed, but turned down again, just like Brother Daniel, because the law was already there. And as she writes, but now I'm no longer worried. I know this is my place, even if my brothers choose not to recognize me as their own, for whom I will always be a stranger. That will only make me closer to God. So here is her Polish previous passport. These are the modern passports which she renewed, and this is the permanent residency card that she held. She had a good relationship with a Catholic father, famous because he was a professor in the Hebrew University, Father Marcel de Bois. He himself wrote to the Minister of Interiors and to the government saying, how is it possible that I got Israeli citizenship, and he did, and this sister doesn't? She came here to live and pray together with the Jewish people in the land of the Bible, he says, and she is a survivor, and she was born Jewish. Well, in 1995, she went for the last time to the Ministry of Interior. The Mother Superior at the time, Mère Christine, accompanied her. At that point, the clerk said, I will give you the citizenship. I can see it. I can identify with your story. But you have to give up on your Polish passport. And to that, she replied, I cannot. I'm Polish and I'm Israeli. I'm Jewish and I'm Christian. That was my country, my motherland, the land of my fathers and of my Lord. And in Poland, there was the home. Quite amazing. There was one authority in Israel that couldn't care less for her conversion, and that was the Conference of Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. I was helping the monastery at the time because they ran into financial problems. It was the first time that Sister Paula agreed to what she was pressured many years already, and that is to ask for the compensation money. At that point, the monastery was in such dire condition that they asked me to help. I was trembling when I approached the authorities of the claim committee, and I showed the picture of her dressed as a nun, saying, well, this Jewish lady is a Christian nun. The person at the desk looked at me, and almost with angry eyes, she said, who are we to judge these people? She will be compensated for the atrocities that were there. Finally, I have to come to a close. I've bits and pieces of things that Sister Paula wrote to me. For example, the letter that you see here. Every letter would be opening with the words of the Psalm, Sha'alu Shlom Yerushalayim. In her drawers, there were paper clippings, for example, dealing with lonely soldiers, if they are fed on Shabbat, yes or no. She gave all the ones that she loved, these little stones, one that I'm having always by my desk, which says, peace to Israel. In the last Chanukah of her life, a month before she died, I came to the monastery with a group of Israelis to light Chanukah candles. She was so delighted. She was so moved. One of the people, after we left, realized he forgot a camera inside the church. He went back. He was quite surprised that the Chanukiot, the candelabras, were not there. He asked where they were, And the sister showed him that they were put on the windows. She explained, Sister Paula said to us that the Chanukiah must be put on the window to proclaim the miracle. Well, for me, it was clear in January 2019 that I want to read a Kaddish on her tomb. Graciously, the sisters accepted that, and I read the Kaddish. Why? Well, I just felt it. But a week later, Daisy, her only relative in Israel, who holds some of her stuff, showed me that paper clipping. That paper clipping about Lustiger's request for the saying of Kaddish on his tomb. I felt reassured that that's what she wanted. But to our amazement and great excitement, about a month later, another little note was retrieved from Sister Paula's possessions. It is this one. In her own handwriting, she writes the words of the Kaddish, Yeheh Shlama Rabba B'Shmaya. And down below it says my name, Yisca, and again in Polish, Yisca. I was reassured the second time that this is what she wanted. I will take the last 2 minutes to show you this video, the video of myself saying the Kaddish. I wasn't aware of the fact that somebody took that film, and I couldn't be aware of the fact that at the very end, the person with a cross behind me will make the sign of the cross as I'm completing my Kaddish. So I'd like you to look at that.
דיברה קירותי והמליך מלכותי ויצמח פורקני ויקרב משיחי בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהא שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה באמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל העולם ואמרו אמן.
So I'd like to conclude. Today's day, Shoa International Day. There are 6 million stories and there are other million stories of survivors. All stories are pretty amazing. I chose 3 stories because I think these are exemplary figures of incredible faith and inner strength to pursue what they believed in. Formal Judaism was not ready because of the previously mentioned gaps to accept them, to recognize them as Jews. But as we know, there are many types of Judaisms. And there are those that will define Aharon Lustiger, Shmuel Hofhausen, and Rachel Dronjek as Jews, despite their stories. So for me, one thing is clear. And that is that when they were interred, when they gave up their soul to the Creator, they were complete with their identity. They died as Jewish people. I want to thank very much the people who gave me materials and photographs, and I'll just mention a few. First of all, the families of the survivors. Eli Dotan, the nephew of Brother Daniel, the family of Rochale, Sister Paula, and most of all, my good friend Daisy Dronjek, who lives in Israel. The sisters from Mount of Olives, first and foremost, Sir Christine, the one who introduced Sir Paula to me, and others that I cannot start that long list of thank yous. But I want to thank very much Professor Effie Shoham-Steiner and his Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters, and to thank Professor Jackie Feldman and Dr. Becky Cook from the Raab Center of the Holocaust and Revival Studies. So thank you all.
Thank you, Yisca, for a breathtaking lecture. It was incredibly moving and interesting. I'm deeply honored to be here and to be able to share some thoughts with you. Perhaps I just mention before I begin that we're accepting questions on the chat. If anyone would like to introduce some questions on the chat, and then if time remains, or as far as time remains, we'll be taking the questions from the chat. The stories of these three individuals carry with them many lessons, many legacies, universal lessons and universal legacies. I will not aspire or assume to be able to discuss them, but I would like in my very brief time to share three concluding thoughts that I have, thoughts related to possible lessons, or as we say in Hebrew in Israel, lekachim, that what we might want to think about or take away from these stories for us as Israelis. Clearly, the great issue raised by all three stories is a deeply theological question, a question of belief and perhaps of redemption, and of who has the authority to determine what true belief is. However, for Israelis and for Israeli society, these three individual stories have meaningful and deeply important political implications as well. The question for us is not limited to who is a Jew, or who has the authority to determine this question of who is a Jew, but also, or rather, or perhaps more to the point for many of us, who is an Israeli? Who belongs to this Israeli state, this Israeli commonwealth, reborn like the phoenix from the ashes of the Holocaust? For whom does this state exist? Whose interests does it deem sacred? Brother Daniel fought not merely for citizenship, but for belonging. He fought for the right to citizenship on the basis of return, of returning to the homeland which he believed he belonged to historically. Brother Daniel, Cardinal Lustiger, and Sister Paula challenged the ruling dominant premise in Israel that belonging to this state is conditioned upon religious belief. They challenged that premise by challenging us as Israelis to acknowledge the possibility that one can be a member of this nation, the people, defined either as Jewish or as Hebrew or as Israeli, while believing in a different theological premise. That one can belong to the people, to its history, to its culture, while maintaining a different set of religious beliefs. They challenged Israel to consider the possibility that nationality and religion were not one and the same. And this challenge has very far-ranging implications for the way the state of Israel is imagined or can be imagined. My second thought. Israeli school children learn about Brother Daniel, as Yisca told us, probably the one story out of these three that most Israelis might have heard of. But they are taught this story, also as Yisca mentioned, not in the context of the history of the Holocaust, but in civics class, as part of their socialization regarding the Jewish identity of the state and the ways in which the law of return, or immigration law, reflects changing notions of identity. They are taught about Brother Daniel less as a Holocaust survivor and mainly as a case which is a sounding board to discuss issues related to citizenship. The Supreme Court appeal known as Bagatz Rufhausen is taught alongside another Supreme Court appeal called Bagatz Shalit, a similar yet different case in which an Israeli Jew, secular and Israeli born, appealed to the Supreme Court to get his non-Jewish children registered as members of the Jewish nationality. Most Israelis do not think of Brother Daniel's story as part of the legacy of the Holocaust. Indeed, most would probably even be unaware of his heroic actions during the Holocaust. So the second thought that I would like to share with you is that these three stories suggest that issues of Israel's identity are part of the legacy of the Holocaust. That the Holocaust, that great divide in Jewish history, changed forever, or should have changed forever, how we think of questions of who is a Jew and what constitutes Jewish identity. People who were exterminated like vermin because they belonged to the Jewish people should be recognized as belonging to the Jewish people because they believe that is the case and because they insist that they belong. We should learn that lesson from the history of the Holocaust. That should be our lekach. Lastly, I feel that this lecture cannot be concluded without raising the question, what is so threatening, what was so threatening and remains threatening about Lustigel, about Brother Daniel, about Sister Paula? Why is it so difficult for Israeli officials to acknowledge their claim to Jewish identity? Because these three individuals challenge a fundamental reality within Israeli society, which I believe is not limited to Israeli society. Lustigel, Paula, and Daniel challenge the fundamental categories of identity, of our worldview. They challenge our need for categories that are neatly defined, clear-cut, categories that are mainly embedded in a binary, good or evil, white or black, east or west, Jew or Arab, and in this case, Jew or Christian. All three of our heroes, which we heard of tonight, break these binaries. Their identities are hybrid identities. They are both Christian and Jew. They are both of us and of them. The Holocaust rendered the boundaries and categories that we knew to be obsolete. The Holocaust defied the traditional categories and gave birth to the hybrid. But this is difficult and threatening and frightening for anyone and for Israel as well. Israel is frightened to acknowledge this hybridity for fear of what it will discover about itself, about its own identity. But today, more than ever, this kind of reckoning is important. In this age of reckoning, in this age of renewed extremism, the hope, I believe, lies in acknowledging the hybrid. Thank you very much. This basically concludes the formal part of the evening. And as I said before, we will now be addressing questions that were raised from the chat. And Professor Shoa, you will take it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you, both to Dr. Cook and to Yisca Harani for fascinating lecture and very, very poignant concluding remarks. The first question that came up in the chat was, what would you say to Catholics with Jewish backgrounds who lost their Jewish ancestors in the Holocaust and seek to live a Jewish and Christian Catholic life today? So I wonder who of you would take this question and delegate it or try and answer it.
Well, I will just say that what I've learned from these three personalities, and personally from Sister Paula, is that one should follow their faith. And if their faith is, I am Catholic, I grieve for the past, or if I'm now Jewish and I grieve for the past is the past. The question is, what do you choose in the present to do? The courage of Oswald in the Holocaust is something different than the courage that he had here to be a Jew in a Carmelite habit. The courage of Rachel running away from the ghetto of Lomja is a different courage. Maybe you can say it's the same, but it's a different historical courage. So I would just say it's all a matter of faith and pursuing your identity. It's all about not losing your identity because others tell you what the limits of your identity should be.
Thank you. I would like to ask you maybe an informative question. During your lecture on Brother Daniel, you referred to the fact that he created a community around him of Holocaust survivors that were interested in being in touch with a figure like himself. Could you elaborate more on that? Can you tell us more about who these people were? What was the nature of their relationship with Brother Daniel? Why was Sister Paula rejecting this kind of relationship? If you can maybe speak some more about it.
I'll tell you the little that I know. I wasn't part of the Haifa community, which still thrives. But what Brother Daniel did, which was a real pioneering step, he came here with the understanding that Hebrew is the language of the state. And Jesus spoke Hebrew or Aramaic, doesn't matter. He didn't speak Polish and also not Arabic. So his idea was to create a community of people who pray in the Hebrew language. Now, these people were not the survivors. This was not the case. Actually, between the survivors and Brother Daniel, there was kind of schizophrenic relationship. They adored him, they loved him, but they couldn't understand his move. They just couldn't. Mm-hmm. And we heard this in the film, and I think it was very, very clear that they dearly love him, yet they cannot identify with that thing itself. So for Brother Daniel, it was very important to have a community that lives the Israeli lifestyle. He did not want to be like a European Christian community and the Christian Catholic garb. So you saw he was dressed as a regular citizen. This is how he moved about. The friend that he had from Poland, that sister who was a Carmelite previously, she decided to do the same. She lives, she lives in Haifa till today, and she walks around to the grocery store, and she's doing this and that, and a devout Catholic. So for Sister Paula, and I'm not even trying to go now into psychological analysis, but it is clear that Sister Paula was left completely alone in Poland after the war was over, and the home that she found, the sisters that she found, was the Benedictine monastery. For her to move out of that home setting with clear lifestyle, that was not an option. Now, one time she said to me, you know, the Benedictine lifestyle is like the Orthodox home. The Orthodox home has got rules. It has time frames. And in the Benedictine monastery, I'm an Orthodox Jew. So maybe the fear of coming out and being part of that community is actually becoming an orphan again. Mm-hmm. It would be a family, but not that type of a family of the Benedictine sisters. And indeed, on Mount of Olives, the sisters loved her. They loved her. And as in this very nice film that I advise all of you to look at, done by the Israeli TV 2 years ago, she would say every Shabbat Shalom, she would fast on Yom Kippur. So she was unique, but she was in a family that accepted her for all that complexity and variety.
Mm-hmm. Two more questions that I'm fielding from our audience. One is about gender. Do you sense that there is a gender difference in the conversion stories of these three individuals? Is there something very male gender about the conversion of Brother Daniel and Cardinal Estudio, and the female more or a different kind of gendered approach in the conversion of Sister Paula? That's one question. And the other one is a very personal question. How did your relationship with Sister Paula start?
Okay. I'll begin with saying that the major difference is not the gender issue. I think the difference is between Aharon Lustiger and Daniel and Paula, because Lustiger was a 14 years old who was not fearing for his life. He did not see death before his eyes. He does record several anti-Semitic events in his childhood, and it was definitely with a lot of fear to go through the years of the war. But he was to meet Christianity in a very different setting. What was tantalizing to many people was that after the murder of his mother in Auschwitz, after his father was in Auschwitz, how could he still hang on to Christianity? So there's a different story. With Brother Daniel, if there's a gender issue, it's the fact that this righteous among the nations, this Mother Superior Yezidia, who acted in an unbelievable heroic way. She was in a way a mother to him, and he found there in his 4 months in the monastery, he found books, he read, and in that respect, he was like Sister Paula. Sister Paula found Christianity without having anyone to save her life except herself. Sister Paula is a self-rescue story, but it was a discourse with Jesus on the cross that brought her this identification. How did I meet Sister Paula? I'm a teacher and educator of Jewish-Christian relations. I'm an activist in the interreligious field for many years. Some 27 or 30 years ago, I used to bring my students to the monastery on Mount of Olives because the Mother Superior, Mère Christine, spoke Hebrew well. And she introduced her faith in a beautiful way. She opened for me a road how to do interreligious activity. She introduced to me Sister Paula. She never said, meet, this is a Jewish person. Sister Paula came out all of a sudden saying in Hebrew, Ani Yehudiya. And then, to my amazement, she told me a little bit. Throughout the years, we developed a very, very close relationship without me interviewing or researching her about her past. Maybe because of that, she found in me someone very close. I was not intruding into her past. I just accepted her as she was. And for her, I think my Jewishness was extremely important. Effie, I'll just tell you one more story very quickly. I wrote it in one of my blogs, but it is a powerful one. I was allowed, something which is very rare, in the monastery because of the previous Mother Superior, to enter the vigil, the night of a Triduum, of the Holy Week, where Jesus, the crucifix, is laid on the floor. Everyone kneels down. There's complete silence. It's in the part of the monastery nobody's allowed except the sisters. I was allowed in. I was there, and all of a sudden, in that silence and in that a dramatic atmosphere, comes Sister Paula and tells me that I should go and eat in my room. And then she comes a second time, and in the third time, she comes with a plastic bag that makes awful noise and says, you see, here's your sandwich. You must go and eat in your room. I couldn't understand why she wanted me out. Today, or after her death, I do realize she was afraid that near a cross, a Jew may convert. And in that case, I will go through her torture. I promised myself many years ago that this will not happen. In a way, I think that I should have told Paula, don't worry, I'll be a Jew. And as your heart is big and compassionate to everybody, so is my heart. And that's where we met.
Yisca Harani and Dr. Becky Cook, I thank you both for a fascinating evening. I thank our listeners and viewers, both on Facebook Live and through the Zoom, for joining us, for joining this event by the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters at Ben-Gurion University and the Sydney and Esther Rabb Center for Holocaust Studies at the same university. I encourage you to look us up on Facebook, on the web, tune into our events, and join us in future events that we host. Thank you very much and good evening.
Thank you, Effie. Thank you, Becky.